Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. This week I want to talk about AI, which is something that's, I think, been on many people's minds. And the questions about, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? What is this thing? And AI will take over not because of the convenience or capabilities or effectiveness. It will not be that it makes a better doctor or a better essay writer, although all of these things may well be true. It will take over because of our desire. As Murray Rudy writes, ethical consistency is on some level a matter of blind faith. And it is this blind faith, this stepping into desire and the paradox of desire, that is how I want to talk about AI as opposed to limiting it to the question of intelligence. So although there are different views on what AI will or will not mean, even so there seems to be a general consensus, which is that we do not really know. Some think optimistically about it, others think apocalyptically about it. But the two questions to keep in mind as we go through this podcast are, firstly, can we look at each of our responses to AI as a calling out in the unknown? And secondly, can we look at the effect we experience as the effect of uncertainty? So, in other words, looking past the notion of good, bad, right, wrong, we start to think about what our response to uncertainty is, what the feeling of uncertainty is. And what we are facing is otherness. And alterity is the otherness, the unknownness. It is the fear of either being replaced by or displaced by. It is also the desire of being lifted up to new heights. This otherness is the otherness of hope and fear. And if we return to our two questions, can we look at each of our responses to hope and to fear as a calling out to the unknown? And can we look at the effect we experience as the effect of uncertainty? What is our relationship to otherness? Will AI ruin the lives of millions of people, or will it save the lives of millions of people? This is simplistic, perhaps too simplistic, yet it does illustrate the dichotomy of hope and dread. That for some, AI is an evolution, and for others, AI is a devolution. From a dialectical perspective, it is both. And because there is such uncertainty in answering this question, because we do not know for sure, a tertiary question is asked, or may be asked, which is our response to the unknown of AI. And this, right or wrong, rational or irrational, is the question of survival. Now, my bias is informed by the platitudes I heard of globalization in my early teens. And I went along with it not because I understood it, but because I trusted that harm is always taken into consideration as a fundamental operating principle. And now, this was not because I was naive about harm. It was because this was what I wished. Now, history contradicts fantasy, and the fantasy of globalization and the reality of globalization are dissimilar. I share this not to make a direct parallel, i.e., statements that globalization is AI and hence embedded within AI is a socio-economic form of exploitation. And as true as and as obvious as this is, given AI learns from our bias, prejudice, and the mechanisms of othering, rather, I am interested in the question of desire, the wish, and how this is itself blinding. The wish that all things will be good, resulting in a tunnel vision of desire, which becomes the story to assimilate to. So what this means is we have a bias towards whatever the protection against uncertainty is. And that goes back to the two questions that we were talking about earlier, the response to the unknown and the effect of uncertainty. An example of this is the story of globalization. And we are told a very simple story. We are told that the rising tides of globalization is a universal ascent without harm. Of course, this was and is not true. So how do we square this circle? we name it and then rationalize it as if it was inevitable. For example, the rationalization of the harmful impacts of globalization is firstly, globalization did a lot of good and did more good than it did harm. And secondly, any change is inevitable, and so change inevitably involves harm. Now, what is this doublespeak? Is it good? Is it bad? How is it good, but then it's bad, but we always knew it was bad? Well, it's not bad because it was inevitable, but we didn't know, but we say we did, but we should have. Well, maybe. Either way, it's more good than bad. And plus, well, what's done is done, and no point in crying over spilled milk. This is obviously nonsensical, but this is actually the basic argument for globalization, right? That, it's really good. Well, it was good for some. Well, of course it was going to have these negative things, but then they're actually better in the end. And well, that's just an inevitable part of growth. And so it just turns into this nonsensical way of framing our understanding. Yet it is actually very sensical in the language of desire. So it doesn't, in a linear sense, make sense, right? The arguments are clearly undermining themselves. But if we think of it like in the language of desire, it makes a lot of sense. And so the failure of globalization is not the failure of globalization as such. It is the failure to understand desire. The common value of greed, that greed is good, which is the line from a movie, Wall Street, which normalized the dysregulation of desire as a necessary compulsion of the good. Now, let's just take a step back from globalization and think about COVID-19. When we think about the tragic lesson of COVID, where we as a human species let millions upon millions of people die, and we ask, what did we learn? Well, one of the lessons was we can let millions upon millions of people die. And quite strikingly, the marginal assistance, the small assistance that was in some cases given, but not to everybody, is now resulting in inflation, which has had further impact on people, further negative impact on people. So put simply and paradoxically, helping is hurting within our structure. This makes sense in a system that is based in the normalization of exploitation as a good. Hence, we are helping is hurting and hurting is helping. Yet it doesn't actually address the platitudes where we look singularly at one outcome, hope, and look away from the other outcome, despair and dread. So this does suggest a systematic form of fragmentation which dehumanizes through disconnection. And can we add to this, to other is to exploit? Yet, paradoxically, are we now more connected than ever? So how is it that we are more connected and simultaneously more disconnected at the same time? If we consider what is happening without favoring one or the other, and instead look at the process. So we're not saying, connection is good or disconnection is bad or any of these things. We're just looking at them as a process, and we see opposing forces. For example, we see helping and hurting, good and bad, being and non-being, and so on. What we're observing is a paradox, right? We're not picking good over bad or whatever, or being over non-being. We're just observing that it is a paradox. And it is from this paradox that AI is born. So any of the hopes and worries we have about AI are guesses, which are verified in time. However, it is unclear if even this is the case, as AI, as I mentioned, history is the story we tell and do so to make sense of our pain through the narratives of rising and triumph. So Gordon Gekko, in the same film I was quoting, Wall Street, said, greed is good. He was stating the obvious. The revelation, if we want to call it that, came not from the innovation of his idea. As clearly greed is not a new idea in history and human experience. Rather, the revelation came in the unspoken desire being spoken. the taboo of greed was no longer a taboo. In other words, as a dimension of desire, it was now being expressed. It was clearly known, but it was now being expressed. So we need to believe that we can and shall conquer the crisis of alienation. Desire in any form, greed or other, is alienation, and we will continually seek that which we desire and try to constitute our desire as undeniable. In other words, we will hide or in other ways, other aspects of our desire, which creates this fragmentation, this alienation, which is necessary for growth and development. Thus, the kind of rational, quasi-irrational argument about globalization. It's good, but it hurts people, but hurting people is inevitable, and so on and so forth, which makes sense in the language of desire. And the taboo of greed, in the case of the movie Wall Street, was excised and no longer a taboo. So we need to believe that we can and shall conquer the crisis of alienation, yet desire in any form, greed or other, is alienation. And we will continually seek that which we desire and try to constitute our desire as undeniable. So it is this relationship between conscious and unconscious, or taboo and sharing and performing these needs and desires as not being taboo. It's as a kind of transgression, and this is embedded in our socio-human conditioning. So we learn the relationships of, for example, the taboos and desires and so on in terms of how they are constituted within a cultural frame. So if we take a step back and we turn to the idea of AI for a moment, the two basic arguments about AI right now are: one, it will be destructive in ways that we do not understand, and two, it will not be. The latter group, the it will not be group, says the former group, it will be group, is being dramatic, whereas the former group says that the latter is being naive. Both are necessarily true while being empirically irrelevant. How so? Well, we're guessing. By analogy, we're guessing how many fish we'll catch or we won't catch on a fishing trip we don't really understand and we may not take or we are taking. This is desire. Desire is alienation, and it is within this alienation that we must step beyond and be inspired to step beyond our contingent understanding. Yet we need not act wholly without awareness. We do know about human behavior. In other words, we're not completely blindfolded in this. Rather, in the same way that Gordon Gekko was speaking about greed, and it was not a revelation, he was simply expressing the taboo. With AI, we can similarly say, there is no question we will exploit and harm people. So for example, one of the arguments is that AI can simply be turned off. Hence, we will always have control. This is not an amazing argument because we do destructive things all the time, and we do not turn them off. We keep on doing these destructive things. So the idea that if it's bad, we'll stop doing it, that's not an amazing argument. There's simply no evidence to support the notion that humans will do no harm. Another argument is that AI will be smarter than us, and some say AI is smarter than us now. Either case, this is both exciting and disturbing depending on your perspective. Yet, is it really simply a matter of smarter versus dumber? To me, the missing piece here is power. Intelligence alone is not enough. We can talk about intelligence, and we then don't talk about power, the elephant in the room. The question of power is the determining factor. Consider the tragic example of Alan Turing, who saved millions of lives with his intelligence. Yet it was not enough to combat the systematic hate of homosexuals. This vile equation saw nothing of the value of intelligence, even when self-interest was involved, favoring instead the virtue of hate. With this in mind, it's a simplification to say that AI is an instrument we can, pick up and put down or turn on or turn off. To speak about intelligence alone as if it's some sovereign agent, that's problematic and somewhat convenient. We do not live and think in isolation. And paradoxically, this is the strength of AI. It learns collectively in a way that we as humans often guard against. It's a simplification to say that AI will take over. Not only has it taken over, and not only are we handing it over, more fundamentally, we are the parents of AI. The question to ask is, what is the family into which AI is being born? We cannot unplug it, and such arguments made by some scientists are made only a breath away from them making the very important argument that the best way to ensure AI is safe is to ensure many people, as many people as possible, are using it. So how do you square that circle? You would need to have a lot of people unplug it. Yes, of course, there's models and there's certain things that are barriers, and my argument here is unquestionably overly simplistic. But looking at it in the language of desire, assuming that we will do things that are not destructive, just doesn't really unfold based upon our experience. It does not lay out or scale forward what will or won't happen. But it does mean that the relationship to desire is something that we can consider as a mitigating factor. Now, to handle or address this issue, some scientists and others make what to me are somewhat vague statements about regulation and enforcement, which are not realistic. However, I actually don't think that's their point. Some seem to understand that regulation is political and not empirical, and this clouds the motives at the inception. So asking people who don't really understand AI to say they're going to regulate AI is just a PR move. It's not actually a deeper understanding of what's going on here. It's not going to work, number one. And number two, the way in which public relations operates and reason is they serve different masters, right? One is serving the fantasy, the other one is serving the reality of the situation. So the fantasy that we're going to just say no to drugs that Nancy Reagan propagated is clearly a PR move, or was clearly a PR move, and a fallacious and dangerous one at that. So taken together, some haphazard regulations idea point to the paradox of desire itself. Hence, this is why we are back at the incomprehensibility of desire. Basically, we all pick a reason that, at least temporarily, satiates our need to control uncertainty, hence our need for power. All of this leads to what we seem to want and desire from AI, which is to be master. We want to make our lives easier, to make money, to impress people, to know that which we do not know, and to be protected against that which we do not know and cannot know, and against not knowing, against uncertainty. We want to be the boss. We want to be the decider. We want to be gods again. And just like the desire we feel, we want to be freed from our humanity, which constrains our desire. We want to commit harmful, destructive acts, not because we want to commit harmful and destructive acts, but because we want to be freed from the constraints that our desire pushes against. And that we do this to other people in acts of alienation through our desire, that we murder other people in acts of alienation through our desire, that we proliferate the doctrine of survival as a reason to harm ourselves and others. This is not a question of AI. And it is quite duplicitous. To call this a biological act or to call this an intellectual act and to substantiate our desire and our compulsions is to use AI as a way to conceal the aspects of our own experience which we have not faced. It is a taboo. In other words, the way in which destruction occurs in and of our lives is a part of our lives. It's not an alien or an alienated part of our being. It is our being. And we are the progenitors of AI. What AI shows us is not what it will do to us, but what we do to each other. We've built a mirror, one that shows us the triumphs that align with our highest aspirations and greatest hopes, as well as the contradictions that cause us to question our very purpose, our very existence. Are we infinite dreamers, or are we crabs in a barrel, or are we one and the same? So these are some ideas that I've been thinking about, and I jotted down some things here. And when I come up against the question of desire, when I think about AI, and when I hear the various different arguments for and against AI or about regulating AI and all the rest of it, I still hear us talking as if we're inventing a new piece of technology, right? This is like inventing the plane, or this is like inventing the printing press. Some people have used those analogies, and to say that there's a paradigm shift as a result of these things. Car is a good example of people saying, the car was a real paradigm shift. Television is another example. However, one of the X factor here is time. So when the car was invented, it wasn't the case that the next day we jumped from the invention of the car to having millions upon millions upon millions of cars everywhere. There was a process of the car. Similarly with the printing press, yes, it played a significant role. But if you think about printing today versus printing when the printing press came about, which was somewhere in the 1400s, then it's a totally different thing. Effectively, many people have what can be considered not only a printing press, but a way of publishing and presenting, circulating their content to an audience that's greater than many people had who were having their works printed. I think it was, I can't remember if it was Kierkegaard or Nietzsche talking about self-printing and how, kind of like an indie musician, they were hoping that they would sell enough to cover their costs, and they didn't. So, we were talking about small run printing. And yes, it was the beginning of a paradigm shift, but the unfolding of that took hundreds of years. Cars, faster, for sure. The unfolding of that took place within 100 years. The question of AI is, it's taking place in a time where time is compressed. So it's not the case. For example, right now people are saying, well, AI could be able to do all these unfathomable, crazy things in 5 years, right? They're not saying 50 years, they're not saying 100 years, they're saying 5 years. So if you imagine that the printing press was made and they said, well, within 5 years, everybody will have a printing press in their home and they'll be able to circulate that around the world. That would have seemed outlandish. If when the car was made, somebody said within 5 years, a great many families, a great many people around the world will have cars and access to cars. That would have seemed pretty daunting. However, in the sphere of AI, it's the case that in 5 years, we can't even imagine the extent to which AI will be propagated in our society and in our cultures internationally. And we can't even imagine the effect of that. We can guess, and we do guess, and people will get onto news things and they will talk about stuff, but it'll be like no different than sports broadcasters guessing about how athletes will do, and they'll be wrong sometimes, they'll be right sometimes, they'll think it was because they knew, they'll think it because they didn't know, but it was really just a big rolling of the dice. This is why the piece about desire, I think, is so informative. If we see AI as being birthed from the contradiction of our own existence, that we are a paradox of love and hate, and that within that AI is learning from us. To pretend that AI won't be engaging in the very same behavior that we engage in seems pretty naive. Yet in the same breath, I can understand the hesitation to operate under the assumption that this is like out of the movie The Terminator, that this is Skynet or Sky, whatever it was called, and it's going to take over. I think it's not that one's true and the other one's untrue, or even that they're both true and false, but it's more that the uncertainty and the unknown has been expressed in a way that it is just not clear why it is that our relationship to certainty and uncertainty becomes more important than being able to observe the experiences that are existing in a very transparent way. There's simply no question that exploitation is going on, and there's simply no question that this has been developing. COVID-19 and the effects of the pandemic have taught us horrific lessons. People can say, oh, there's certain advances. Yes, but there is also a darkness to it. We didn't come out of this pandemic, this global experience, saying, wow, we're all floating around on a rock and we need to help each other. We didn't do that. We've actually doubled down on fragmentation. And if we are entering into a period of, let's call it exacerbated fragmentation, and AI as a part of that, I don't think it's entirely naive of me to say the way AI can and will be used will reflect that fragmentation. And this then means using AI as a way to combat and to fight. In other words, like I was saying earlier, that this is a question more of power than intelligence. And the Turing example, I mean, there's so many, but it speaks to the naivete that we have when it comes to, intelligence rises above and reason rises above. That's just simply not true. We act habitually based upon our desires, and our desires construct our identity. I'm not saying that's what AI will do, but I am asking the question, is that not what we do? And if, as I think it is, and maybe I'm completely wrong, AI is a mirror of sorts that will embody dimensions of the human experience. Yes, it will be able to collate information in a way that human beings can't, but the information is coming from human beings. And so what is this birth? What is this birthing? What are we going to see in and of ourselves? So the AI question as a mirror, as a reflection of desire, is something that I'll return to, I have no doubt, in the coming, months and years. But for now, I just want to point out that if we look at power and we look at the way in which desire operates in a paradoxical way, and that alienation is a core part of our experience. We need to separate or to alienate in order to grow. Yet within that, destruction arises. And to acknowledge that destruction and to bring it out into the open does not mean we're being overly cynical. It just means we're seeing the horizon. So, until next time, bye for now.